So now we have our character look and our movement controls done. Let's move on to adding in the edible dots. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create two game objects. We want to call one scene manager and we're going to call the other one dots. We're going to place our scene variables inside of our scene manager just for the sake of organization. Next, we're going to find our dot mesh. We're going to grab that and we're going to drag that to be a child of the dots game object. And let's place that behind our Chomp-Man character. Next, we're going to create a material for our dots game object. And we're going to place that within our prop folder. And I'm just going to drag that material on our dots game object. And we're just going to add just a little bit of a mission. The next thing we want to do is we want to add a spherical collider, and we're going to make that a trigger to our dots game object as well. We're just going to make that just a little bit larger than our dots game object. Next, let's tag our dots game object, and we're going to create a new tag. I'm just going to call that tag dots. So with our initial setup created, let's create a flow machine for our game object. We're going to save this into our macro folders, and we're going to call this dots macro. So before we begin creating our flow state, let's first walk through the logic that we need to happen. So when our character goes over our dots pellet, the dot pellet disappears and the character's mouth open and close blend shape is activated. So let's begin with a on trigger enter node. So for on trigger enter node, we want to make sure that it first checks to make sure that our character is actually the one interacting with it. We don't want our ghost to be able to consume the dot pellets as well. So let's add a component compare tag. And the tag that we want to compare is the tag of the player. So let's create a string scene object. Let's call that value player, since that's the tag of the player that we set in our previous lesson. I'm just going to drag that into our scene. So we want to use a branch node. So we're going to say if this result is true, we want it to destroy this game object as well as activate the mouth open and closing blend shape. So to do that, let's create a Boolean scene variable and let's call this variable can eat. So we want to say if that's true, we want to set that can eat to true. Then we want to destroy this game object. So before we add the chomp blend shape functionality, let's go and make sure that this is working correctly. So we can see that we have our can eat is true, our dot is destroyed. So for now, we can remove our start and our update. And let's go back to our chomp character. And let's go to our blink state machine. And we want to right click and create a new super state. And we're going to call this super state eating SS. So let's go into our super state. And let's for our start state, we're just going to call that idle. And we're going to right click and we're going to create another flow state. We're going to make a transition. And in that transition, we want that to check if the eating bool is true. So we're going to grab our eating boolean and we're going to get a branch node. And we're going to say if true, we want it to transition. And we're going to have an update because we want to make sure that's checking every frame. And let's go back in our transition. Let's copy this right here and go back out and create another transition going from eating back to idle. And let's paste that into our new transition. And we're going to say on false, we want that to transition back. So for now, we're going to delete everything that's inside of that state. And since we already have our blend shapes action set up within our state machine, let's go into our blinking state. So let's grab all our nodes. We're going to copy these and we're going to paste these into our eating state. And we're going to replace our blinking weight and our blinking speed variable with a similar float variable, but we're going to name that mouth weight and mouth speed. And we're going to make these object variables. And let's go 600 for our mouth speed. And we also want to make sure that we change our index of our set blend shape weight set to 1. Because if we go back into our character, into our skin mesh, we can see that the blend shape for our mouth is actually the second blend shape. Since our index starts in a similar way as an array, our first number starts at 0 and our second one starts at 1. Next, we want to put the logic in place that once the mouth weight equals 100, that the can eat then equals false, so it transitions back to the idle state. So before we continue, let's test our logic, but we first need to go back into our main state, and we need to make sure that this is toggle start as well. So we should now have both our blink and our eat state green. So we can see that we're in our idle state, and we can see that once we ate the pellet that our character closed his mouth. So now let's put the logic in place that the character opens his mouth once it transitions back to idle. So what we're going to do is we're just going to grab all these nodes that we had for the closing, and I'm just going to copy those, and we're going to go to our idle. I'm just going to paste those in our idle. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to change this add to a subtract. And the next thing we need to do is we need to add a logic node to say that we only want this to happen once the value is greater than 0. So while the character is in idle and at 0, we don't want to continue to subtract from our blend shape. So we're going to say if the mouth value is greater than 0, we want it to begin subtracting from that mouth value until it equals 0. So let's duplicate a couple of these, and let's hit play to test that out. So we can see that the character now opens and closes his mouth whenever he eats one of the dots. So now that we have that complete, let's add the sound effect to once our character eats the dots. So we're going to go to our dots flow graph, and we want to add a play audio source one shot. And we also want to create a scene variable for our audio source as well. So we're going to go into our scene variables, and we're going to say audio FX source. And before we place our value in there, let's go to our main camera. Let's create a new game object, and we're going to call this game object sound FX audio source OBJ. And let's create one for our game music as well. So we're going to duplicate this game object, and we're going to just create one for our game music, and just going to call this one game music audio source. And I'm just going to place an audio source component on both of these. Now let's go back to our scene variables, and let's set this as audio source variable type, and let's drag our sound effects audio source to this value. And we want to move that out, and we want to make sure that it's getting our audio source value. So we also want to set this to before it destroys the game object, because once it's destroyed, it won't be able to play our audio source. So we want to set that right in front of the source game object. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add our eating sound effect. So we're just going to grab our munch one. I'm just going to drag that into our audio one shot. So if we hit play now, we not only have our blend shape animation of our character eating them pellets, but we also have our sound reinforcement as well. Let's grab our pellets. And what we're going to do is we want to drag these into our prefab folder, and we want to make a prefab of our pellet. So we're going to go to our prefab folder, and we're just going to drag that into our prefab to make a prefab variant of this object. And let's go, and we're also going to make sure that transform and our positions are 0. And we're going to remove these, and we can now set up our dots prefab into our scene. But before we do that, we also want to make sure that we update our Chomp prefab as well, since we added those extra elements into our blink state machine, as well as the extra object variables. So we're going to again copy the component from both our state machine and our object variables and go into our open prefab and make sure that's updated as well. So we're going to save our scene, and now we're going to just lay out our dots across our scene. So in the next lesson, we'll continue adding on to our gameplay, adding our point system and point display, as well as our power up and power pellets. So be sure to save your scene and join us in the next video.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to be the first to see this and many other tutorials, game development tips, and free game asset giveaways.